The introduction of thinking fast and slow sets the stage for an exploration of how humans think and make decisions. Daniel Kahneman begins by acknowledging that much of our daily thinking happens without conscious awareness. Thoughts, impressions, and judgments often arise automatically, shaped by underlying cognitive processes that we rarely question. The book's purpose is to reveal the mechanisms behind these processes and to show how they influence our choices and judgments. Kahneman introduces the key theme of the book: the biases in human judgment and decision-making. These biases, he explains, are not random but systematic, recurring under predictable conditions. For example, when someone confident and charismatic presents an idea, people tend to evaluate it more favorably, a phenomenon known as the halo effect. This and other biases, like overconfidence and anchoring, can lead to errors in both personal and professional contexts. The introduction also presents the central concept of cognitive heuristics, mental shortcuts our brains use to simplify complex decisions. While these shortcuts are efficient and often useful, they also make us prone to predictable errors. Kahneman compares the study of biases to the study of diseases in medicine. Just as understanding diseases helps improve health, understanding biases can lead to better decision-making. Kahneman's ultimate goal, as outlined in the introduction, is to enrich the language people use when discussing decisions, making it easier to recognize and address cognitive errors. By giving names to these patterns, like the availability heuristic or the illusion of understanding, he provides tools for diagnosing and improving judgment. He also hopes to inspire readers to question their own beliefs and choices more critically. The introduction concludes with a glimpse into the origins of the ideas presented in the book, which stem from decades of collaboration between Kahneman and his colleague Amos Tversky. Their groundbreaking research laid the foundation for the fields of behavioral economics and decision science, challenging traditional assumptions about rationality. Kahneman invites readers to embark on a journey through the fascinating and often surprising ways our minds work, promising insights that are both intellectually stimulating and practically useful. The first part of Thinking Fast and Slow introduces two fundamental systems of human thought. These systems, referred to as System 1 and System 2, form the foundation for understanding how we process information, make decisions, and judge situations. System 1 is fast, intuitive, and automatic. It handles tasks like recognizing faces, answering simple math problems such as 2 plus 2, or detecting anger in someone's voice. In contrast, System 2 is slow, deliberate, and effortful. It comes into play when we solve complex math problems, analyze arguments, or decide where to invest money. While both systems are necessary, their interplay often results in predictable errors in judgment. System 1 is always active, scanning the environment and offering impressions, feelings, and intuitions. For example, if you're asked, "Is Steve a librarian or a farmer?" System 1 might immediately suggest librarian if the description of Steve matches the stereotype, even though statistical reality says farmers vastly outnumber librarians. System 2, if engaged, could override this impulse by considering the base rates. However, engaging System 2 requires effort, and people often default to the quicker, less energy-intensive System 1. The human mind is wired to conserve cognitive energy. This tendency can be observed in tasks requiring attention and effort. When you are asked to multiply 17 by 24 mentally, you likely feel your pulse quicken slightly, a sign of System 2 taking control. However, System 2 is not only slow but also lazy. It prefers to delegate to System 1 whenever possible. For instance, if you're driving on an empty highway, System 1 can handle the task. But when a sudden obstacle appears, System 2 jumps in to make critical decisions. One striking example of how these systems interact is what Kahneman refers to as the associative machine. This is System 1's ability to connect ideas and events seamlessly. Imagine the phrase, "bananas vomit." Your mind automatically associates the two words, producing discomfort or disgust, even though no logical link exists. This ability to form connections rapidly is essential for understanding the world, but it also leads to errors. Consider the case of cognitive ease. When something is easy to process, we tend to believe it is true. If a statement is presented in a bold font or repeated several times, we are more likely to accept it as accurate, even if it's false. System 1 is also a machine for jumping to conclusions. It constantly looks for patterns, causes, and narratives, even in random events. If you toss a coin and get heads 5 times in a row, System 1 might whisper that the coin is biased, even though each toss is independent. This propensity for causal thinking extends to our judgments of people and situations. For instance, seeing a charismatic speaker on stage might lead you to assume they are competent, a cognitive bias known as the halo effect. The ways in which System 1 and System 2 interact influence how judgments happen. For example, if someone asks you, "How happy are you with your life?" you might answer based on how you feel at that moment rather than reflecting deeply on your overall satisfaction. This substitution of an easier question for a harder one is a hallmark of System 1's dominance. The mind simplifies complex judgments by answering related, simpler questions, often without realizing it. This leads to systematic biases that affect decisions and perceptions. Kahneman illustrates these ideas with relatable examples and experiments. In one case, participants were asked whether a randomly selected individual named Steve, described as shy and detail-oriented, was more likely to be a librarian or a farmer. Despite the fact that there are far more farmers than librarians, most people chose librarian because the description matched their stereotype. This demonstrates how System 1 overrides statistical reasoning, leading to predictable errors. System 1's tendency to jump to conclusions and rely on heuristics is both its strength and its weakness. While it allows us to navigate the world efficiently, it also makes us vulnerable to systematic errors. For instance, if you were asked to estimate the frequency of words that begin with the letter K versus those that have K as the third letter, System 1 would likely overestimate the former. Words like kite and kangaroo come to mind more easily than words like make or like, even though the latter are more common. This reliance on ease of recall is known as the availability heuristic, and it shapes many of our judgments and decisions. Throughout this part of the book, Kahneman emphasizes that understanding the interplay between System 1 and System 2 is crucial for improving our decision-making. System 1 provides quick, useful responses in many situations, but its susceptibility to biases requires System 2 to step in and apply critical thinking. The challenge, however, is that System 2's effortful nature means it is not always activated when it should be, leaving us prone to errors. Kahneman's exploration of these two systems sets the stage for the rest of the book, offering a lens through which readers can examine their own thinking patterns. By recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of both systems, we can begin to identify and mitigate the biases that shape our judgments and choices. In the second part of the book, Kahneman delves deeper into heuristics and biases, which are mental shortcuts employed by System 1 to simplify complex decisions. While these shortcuts are often efficient, they can lead to systematic errors. Kahneman's exploration of heuristics reveals the quirks and pitfalls of intuitive thinking, offering compelling experiments and real-world examples to illustrate each concept. One of the most striking biases discussed is the law of small numbers. People often overgeneralize based on limited data, failing to recognize that small samples are prone to extreme outcomes. For instance, a study might report dramatic results based on a tiny group of participants, yet people accept these findings as universally applicable. Kahneman explains how even seasoned researchers fall into this trap, overestimating the reliability of results from small samples. This error stems from System 1's inclination to trust patterns and stories without questioning their statistical validity. Anchoring is another fascinating heuristic that demonstrates how our judgments can be influenced by irrelevant information. In one experiment, participants were asked to estimate the number of African countries in the United Nations. Before answering, they spun a wheel marked with random numbers. Despite the numbers being unrelated to the question, participants who spun a high number gave higher estimates than those who spun a low one. This illustrates how initial reference points, anchors, skew our thinking, even when we know they're arbitrary. The availability heuristic highlights how easily recalled information can distort our perceptions of probability and risk. For example, people are more afraid of plane crashes than car accidents, even though the latter are far more common. This is because plane crashes receive extensive media coverage, making them easier to recall. Kahneman demonstrates that our minds equate ease of recall with frequency, leading us to overestimate the likelihood of vivid, memorable events. Kahneman expands on availability by exploring how emotion amplifies its effects. People are more likely to perceive risks as higher when emotions like fear or anger are involved. For instance, after a highly publicized terrorist attack, individuals might overestimate the likelihood of future attacks, altering their behavior and decisions. This emotional bias underscores how System 1 prioritizes dramatic, emotionally charged scenarios over sober statistical analysis. One of the most compelling examples in this section involves a character named Tom W. Participants were given a description of Tom that aligned with common stereotypes of a computer science student: shy, logical, and detail-oriented. Then, they were asked to predict Tom's field of study from a list of options. Most chose computer science, ignoring statistical realities about the relative popularity of other fields. This experiment demonstrates how the representativeness heuristic overrides statistical reasoning, leading to predictable errors. Another related bias is the conjunction fallacy, illustrated by the famous Linda problem. Participants read a description of Linda as a socially conscious, outspoken individual and were asked to choose whether it was more likely that Linda is a bank teller or a bank teller who is active in the feminist movement. The majority chose the latter option, even though it's statistically less probable. Kahneman explains that this error arises because people focus on how well Linda matches the stereotype of a feminist, neglecting basic principles of probability. The tendency to prioritize causal explanations over statistical reasoning is further explored through the concept of causes trumping statistics. For example, people are more likely to believe in the efficacy of a new medical treatment when presented with anecdotal success stories than when shown statistical evidence. This preference for compelling narratives over dry data highlights the power of System 1's associative thinking. Regression to the mean is another crucial concept. Kahneman explains how extreme performances or events tend to revert to the average over time, yet people often attribute these fluctuations to specific causes. For instance, when a golfer has an exceptional round, their next performance is likely to be less remarkable, not because they choked but due to statistical regression. Failing to recognize this principle leads to flawed judgments in fields ranging from education to sports. To address these biases, Kahneman introduces strategies for taming intuitive predictions. He emphasizes the importance of anchoring judgments in base rates and adjusting for relevant factors, a task better suited for System 2. For example, when predicting a student's performance based on their current grades, it's essential to consider the average performance of their peers and the likelihood of regression to the mean. Throughout this section, Kahneman underscores that heuristics are not inherently bad. They are essential for navigating a complex world. However, their reliance on associative thinking and ease of recall makes them vulnerable to predictable errors. By recognizing these biases, we can begin to counteract their influence, improving our judgments and decisions. This understanding lays the groundwork for the next part of the book, where Kahneman explores the overconfidence that often stems from unchecked intuitive thinking. In this part of the book, Kahneman delves into one of the most pervasive and dangerous cognitive biases: overconfidence. Overconfidence emerges from our reliance on System 1's intuitive judgments, paired with our difficulty in recognizing the limits of our knowledge. Kahneman argues that we often mistake confidence for competence, leading to flawed decisions and a failure to question our assumptions. By unpacking the roots of overconfidence, he offers a critical lens for examining our judgments and predictions. The illusion of understanding is one of the primary drivers of overconfidence. Kahneman explains how we construct coherent stories about the past, attributing causality and logic to events that may have been driven by chance. For example, a company's success might be credited to the vision of its CEO, while its failure could be blamed on poor leadership, even if external factors like market conditions were the true cause. This hindsight bias makes outcomes seem predictable and blinds us to the role of luck and randomness. Building on this idea, Kahneman introduces the illusion of validity, where people place unwarranted faith in their judgments, even when evidence suggests otherwise. For instance, financial analysts and stock traders often believe in their ability to predict market movements, despite overwhelming evidence that such predictions are no better than chance. This bias arises because System 1 excels at finding patterns, even in random data, creating a false sense of confidence. Kahneman explores the tension between intuition and statistical reasoning through the debate of intuitions versus formulas. He highlights research showing that statistical models consistently outperform human judgment in fields ranging from medicine to hiring decisions. For example, simple algorithms used to predict student success, based on a few key metrics, are more accurate than the subjective evaluations of admissions officers. Despite this, people resist using formulas, preferring the subjective confidence of their own intuition. The chapter on expert intuition addresses a critical question. When can we trust our instincts? Kahneman explains that true expertise develops only in environments where patterns are stable and feedback is immediate. For example, a firefighter can develop a sixth sense for danger after years of experience in predictable situations. However, in fields like stock trading or politics, where outcomes are influenced by unpredictable variables, intuition is far less reliable. Kahneman stresses that the mere presence of confidence does not guarantee accuracy. The outside view offers a strategy for countering overconfidence by shifting our focus from individual cases to statistical norms. For instance, when planning a project, people tend to rely on optimistic scenarios specific to their situation, underestimating the time and resources required. By looking at the outcomes of similar projects, the outside view provides a more realistic baseline. Kahneman illustrates this with an example from his own experience. While working on a textbook, his team initially predicted it would take 2 years to complete. Applying the outside view revealed that similar projects often took twice as long, a prediction that ultimately proved accurate. The engine of capitalism exemplifies how overconfidence drives innovation and economic growth. Entrepreneurs, buoyed by optimism, launch businesses despite the high likelihood of failure. Kahneman acknowledges that while this optimism can lead to groundbreaking successes, it also results in significant losses and inefficiencies. For example, most startups fail within a few years, yet the collective belief in success fuels a thriving economy. This paradox underscores the dual nature of overconfidence. It is both a flaw and a force for progress. Throughout this part, Kahneman emphasizes that overconfidence is deeply embedded in human nature. It allows us to navigate a complex and uncertain world with a sense of control, but it also blinds us to the limits of our knowledge. By understanding the mechanisms behind overconfidence, we can begin to question our assumptions, seek out the outside view, and rely more on data-driven methods. This exploration of overconfidence sets the stage for the next section, where Kahneman examines how we make choices and why our preferences often defy logic. In this section, Kahneman shifts focus to the ways we make choices and the factors that shape our preferences. He highlights how traditional economic theories, which assume people are rational decision-makers, often fail to capture the complexities of human behavior. Instead, he introduces prospect theory, a groundbreaking framework that explains how people evaluate potential gains and losses, often in irrational ways. Kahneman begins by challenging the classical utility theory proposed by Daniel Bernoulli. According to Bernoulli, people make decisions to maximize their overall utility or happiness. However, Kahneman demonstrates that this theory fails to account for the psychological impact of gains and losses. For example, losing $100 feels far worse than the pleasure derived from gaining $100. This asymmetry, known as loss aversion, explains why people are often risk-averse when facing potential gains but willing to take risks to avoid losses. Prospect theory builds on this insight by showing that people evaluate outcomes relative to a reference point rather than in absolute terms. Imagine being told that you will receive a $10,000 bonus. If you were expecting $5,000, you'd feel elated, but if you were expecting $20,000, you'd feel disappointed, even though the bonus is the same amount. This relativity of gains and losses highlights the importance of framing in decision-making. One of the most striking examples of framing involves the endowment effect, where people place a higher value on items they already own compared to items they don't. In an experiment, participants were given a mug and later offered the chance to trade it for a pen of equal value. Most chose to keep the mug, even though they had no strong preference for mugs over pens before the experiment. This effect reveals how ownership changes our perception of value, making us reluctant to part with what we have. Kahneman also explores the concept of bad events, emphasizing that negative outcomes carry more emotional weight than positive ones. This explains why people are willing to pay disproportionately high premiums for insurance against rare events, such as natural disasters. Similarly, the fear of bad events drives behaviors like avoiding public speaking or taking unnecessary precautions. Building on this idea, Kahneman introduces the fourfold pattern of risk attitudes, which describes how people react to gains and losses under conditions of high and low probability. For instance, people tend to take risks when faced with a high probability of a small loss but avoid risks when the probability of a large loss is low. This framework helps explain seemingly contradictory behaviors, such as gambling on lotteries while avoiding insurance for low-probability risks. Another key insight from this section is how people perceive rare events. Kahneman explains that vivid imagery and emotional narratives inflate the perceived likelihood of rare occurrences. For example, after a plane crash, people might overestimate the risk of flying, even though statistically, air travel remains one of the safest modes of transportation. This distortion stems from the availability heuristic, as vivid events are easier to recall and feel more likely to occur. Kahneman then turns to risk policies, arguing that people often make inconsistent decisions because they evaluate risks on a case-by-case basis. Adopting a consistent policy, such as always insuring against significant losses, can help avoid this inconsistency. For instance, a traveler who always buys travel insurance avoids the need to reassess the risk for each trip, saving cognitive effort and reducing emotional bias. The concept of mental accounting sheds light on how people keep track of gains and losses in separate accounts, leading to irrational behavior. For example, a person might hesitate to spend a $50 windfall on a luxury item, even though they wouldn't hesitate to buy the same item with their regular income. By treating money differently based on its source, people fail to maximize overall utility. Kahneman explores the idea of reversals in preferences, showing how choices depend on how options are framed. For instance, people are more likely to choose a medical procedure when told it has a 90% survival rate rather than a 10% mortality rate, even though the two statements are logically equivalent. This susceptibility to framing highlights the malleability of human preferences. The section concludes with a discussion of frames and reality, emphasizing that the way choices are presented shapes our perception of reality itself. For example, political debates often hinge on whether policies are framed as benefits or costs. This power of framing underscores the importance of critically examining how information is presented to avoid manipulation. Throughout this part, Kahneman illustrates how our preferences and choices are influenced by psychological biases, emotional responses, and the way options are framed. By understanding these factors, we can become more aware of the pitfalls in our decision-making processes and make more rational, consistent choices. This sets the stage for the final part of the book, where Kahneman explores how our experiences and memories shape our understanding of happiness and well-being. In the final section of Thinking, Fast and Slow, Kahneman explores the profound distinction between two aspects of ourselves: the experiencing self and the remembering self. These two selves do not experience life the same way, and their divergence significantly influences how we evaluate happiness and well-being. This part of the book reveals that our judgments about our lives are shaped more by our memories than by the actual experiences we have. The experiencing self lives in the present, perceiving moments as they occur. It is concerned with the here and now, and its feelings are transient, changing as new moments unfold. In contrast, the remembering self constructs narratives about our lives by recalling key moments. The remembering self is less interested in the duration of experiences and more focused on their peaks, the most intense moments, whether good or bad, and their ends. Kahneman calls this the peak-end rule, which explains why people's memories of events can differ starkly from the reality of the experience. A striking example involves a study where participants underwent two versions of a painful medical procedure. In one scenario, the procedure ended abruptly after a particularly painful moment. In the other, the procedure was extended slightly, but the additional time involved less discomfort. Surprisingly, participants who experienced the longer procedure rated it as less unpleasant overall. This counterintuitive result arises because the ending was less painful, and the remembering self prioritized the final moments over the total duration of pain. Kahneman emphasizes the duration neglect phenomenon. The length of an experience has little influence on how it is remembered. For instance, A week-long vacation with a spectacular ending might be recalled more fondly than a 2-week vacation that ends on a mediocre note, even if the longer trip had more enjoyable moments overall. This insight has profound implications for how we make decisions, as we often prioritize creating memorable moments over maximizing ongoing happiness. The concept of life as a story expands on this idea, highlighting how people construct narratives to make sense of their lives. These narratives focus on significant events and transitions, while mundane or routine experiences are often overlooked. For example, when someone recounts their life story, they are more likely to emphasize milestones like graduating, getting married, or facing major challenges, rather than the countless days spent in quiet contentment. This narrative bias means that the remembering self often overemphasizes dramatic or pivotal moments at the expense of everyday happiness. Kahneman explores the implications of these findings for experienced well-being, which refers to the quality of life as perceived moment to moment. He contrasts this with evaluated well-being, which reflects how people think about their lives as a whole. Surveys on happiness often measure evaluated well-being by asking questions like, "How satisfied are you with your life?" However, these evaluations are heavily influenced by factors like income, status, and recent experiences, which may not accurately reflect the day-to-day reality of the experiencing self. For instance, studies show that while a higher income correlates with greater life satisfaction, its impact on daily happiness is much smaller. Beyond a certain threshold, additional wealth has diminishing returns for experienced well-being, yet people often prioritize earning more money because the remembering self equates it with success and happiness. This disconnect reveals how the goals of the two selves can be misaligned, leading people to chase outcomes that do not truly enhance their daily lives. Kahneman uses the example of vacations to illustrate this conflict. Many people design their trips around creating memorable experiences, visiting iconic landmarks, taking stunning photos, or indulging in unique activities, rather than focusing on what would make them happiest in the moment, such as relaxing or spending time with loved ones. This prioritization of the remembering self's desires often leads to choices that neglect the experiencing self's comfort and enjoyment. The tension between the two selves also influences how we think about thinking about life itself. The remembering self dominates when we reflect on our lives, influencing major decisions about careers, relationships, and leisure. For example, someone might choose a prestigious but demanding job because it aligns with their narrative of success, even if the daily grind brings little satisfaction. Similarly, people might stay in unhappy relationships because the story of their lives includes the commitment they've made, even if their experiencing self suffers. Kahneman concludes this section by exploring how these insights can inform public policy and individual decision-making. He argues that measures of well-being should account for both the experiencing and remembering selves to provide a more holistic view of happiness. For instance, policymakers designing healthcare or education systems should consider not only long-term outcomes but also how people feel during the process. Similarly, individuals can benefit from recognizing the biases of the remembering self and striving to make choices that balance moment-to-moment happiness with meaningful narratives. Ultimately, Kahneman's exploration of the two selves reveals that our understanding of happiness and well-being is far more complex than it seems. By distinguishing between the experiencing self and the remembering self, we can begin to make more informed decisions about how to live our lives and evaluate what truly brings us joy. This profound insight brings the book to a close, tying together its themes of intuitive thinking, cognitive biases, and the nature of human judgment in a way that encourages readers to reflect deeply on their own choices and experiences. Kahneman's parting message is clear. While we cannot completely overcome the biases of our minds, understanding them empowers us to navigate life with greater awareness and intention. In the conclusion of Thinking, Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman brings together the key insights from the book to encourage readers to adopt a more mindful and deliberate approach to decision-making. He emphasizes that while we cannot eliminate the biases inherent in our thinking, understanding their origins and recognizing their influence allows us to mitigate their impact. Kahneman encourages readers to use the tools and concepts presented throughout the book, such as awareness of System 1 and System 2, heuristics, overconfidence, and framing, to critically evaluate their judgments and choices. For instance, when making a significant decision, Slowing down and engaging System 2 can help counteract the snap judgments of System 1. Similarly, seeking out the outside view or statistical benchmarks can provide a more objective perspective and reduce the errors that come from relying solely on intuition. A recurring theme in the conclusion is the idea that better decision-making begins with humility. Recognizing the limitations of our knowledge and the unpredictability of the world is essential for avoiding the traps of overconfidence and hindsight bias. Kahneman also underscores the importance of skepticism, particularly when dealing with vivid narratives or compelling statistics. Questioning the source, context, and framing of information can prevent us from falling prey to cognitive illusions. Kahneman extends these insights beyond individual decision-making to broader applications, such as organizational policies and public decision-making. He advocates for the use of structured approaches like checklists and algorithms in areas where intuitive judgments are prone to error. For example, medical diagnostics, hiring processes, and investment strategies can benefit from evidence-based methods that limit the influence of human biases. The book concludes with a sense of both caution and hope. Kahneman acknowledges that the cognitive biases and errors explored in the book are deeply rooted in the design of the human mind, making them difficult to overcome entirely. However, by cultivating an awareness of these biases and striving for a balance between intuition and reason, individuals and societies can make more informed and effective decisions. Ultimately, thinking fast and slow serves as a powerful guide for anyone seeking to understand their own mind and improve their judgment. Kahneman leaves readers with the profound realization that while our thinking may not always be rational, it can be improved through careful reflection and the application of the principles he so masterfully elucidates. This final message is both empowering and practical, encouraging readers to take the insights from the book and apply them to their everyday lives.